My guest today is the author of this magnificent book here. She is Jennifer Michael Hecht, a historian and poet, award-winning and best-selling author of the histories Doubt, Stay, The Happiness Myth, and The End of the Soul. Her poetry books include Who Said, The Next Ancient World, and Funny. She earned her PhD in history from Columbia University. I think history of science, right, Jennifer?
Mm-hmm.
And teaches in New York City. Okay, the new book is The Wonder Paradox. Here we go. Embracing the weirdness of existence and the poetry of our lives. Jennifer, okay, I'm reading along here in your book, and I come across this passage. It started right from the beginning. How you accidentally became a sort of priest of unbelief. At Caltech, I was signing books after my first large hall doubt lecture, Doubt, the book, when a terrifically pregnant couple handed me the book to sign and asked permission to pose a quick question. That was me, right? That was a Caltech art lecture series.
That is exactly right. I really didn't put it together until a couple hours ago. I thought, wait, that was that Caltech, and that was that, yes. And that's when that happened. I still see the image so clearly in my mind of, getting that question and only realizing slowly that I was going to be asked this kind of question, sort of personal questions about ritual and religion.
Yeah. And let's see, how long ago was this? We went to dinner afterwards. And I think your son was still nursing. So he must have been under one. That must have been late 90s, right?
Right. So, well, no, the book came out 2003.
Oh, 2003. That's right.
Yeah,
okay, that's when it was.
And you're right that wasn't my first talk. It was the first big talk. So it wasn't that year. It was late 2003. Yeah, Max is about to turn 19. So,
oh my gosh.
Yeah, he was a tiny baby. Yeah. He wasn't born when the book came out. So it's their similar length of story that have been raising these two magnificent things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, so really, in a way, Doubt is a kind of a prelude to this book, because this book is about addressing the important issues in life, rituals, and so on without religion. And your book Doubt is about the history of religious doubt throughout the millennia, centuries. But a lot has happened in the 20 years since that book was published in terms of the rise of the nuns, the kind of secularization of the West ever more, even in America, surprisingly. Just in the last decade, the fastest growing group are the no religious affiliation people. They're not necessarily atheists, right? They're whatever they are.
It's a mixed group, but I'm hoping that some of them who now use spiritual will use poetic, because I think spiritual is it's a little sloppy because we just don't have any definition for it. I'd say God is even sloppier. Give me one definition I can deal with, but I meet people who say God is love, and then when we get down to brass tacks, we agree on everything. But I wouldn't use that word, because that word can start to stand in for other things. There's this sort of extra little room for a tiny bit of prayer or a tiny bit of imagining certain kinds of communication with some sort of being. And I don't think that that's the healthy way to go. It's better to just accept what we have here and see the incredible magic that's real, rather than going in for a different kind of superstition.
Yeah, so these dating sites that have a box for you to check spiritual but not religious. I think people that are not traditionally religious tick that box. I guess in a way, I don't think they've really thought it through. Like, what does that mean? I think it's just kind of a way of saying, I'm not Mr. Spock. I'm not some cold, illogical. I do have emotions. Right. I do have awe and wonder. I do care about things deeply. I think they're trying to convey something like that, right?
And I could have rehabilitated the word spiritual. It really just inspire, and spiritual, it just really means the breath. But I thought that one might be confusing. But I felt that it was too important to rehabilitate the word sacred. But I always use it with poetic sacred or natural sacred. And I really mean just what people hold sacred, and what, it's really just what people hold sacred. There are a couple of different ways of using it in those terms, in terms of, I can say that there's something that I believe that's sacred, that is outside an individual person's belief, because I believe that it's already there, but it's because of the human beings feeling it, right? So, yeah. But spiritual, I decided was one of, I don't know exactly what the idea was, but I wasn't going to rehabilitate all the words. But sacred has a strong meaning before religion gets it, just as spiritual does. Um, and liturgy, before the Christians began to use it, meant the celebrations and festivals that any large landed people, men, were responsible for throwing for their town or region. And that became the Christian liturgy, the bunch of things you have to do. Um, and so when you start to look at it like that, uh, some people look at my book and they say, so it's sort of using poetry to replace prayer. And I mean, I even may say that, yes, but I'm very careful to say religion didn't get any of this first. There was poetry before it was supernatural. And certainly before the idea of a monotheistic God and afterlife and all of that. So I think it's really important to say we're not just like, oh, using up these extra things that we found around and making them new no, the Christians in particular came and took a lot. I say the Christians in particular because we're living in a sort of ex-Christian world. I was raised Jewish, and I studied now all the religions, or many, many religions, deeply. And yet, even I am absolutely bathed in this very Western Christian world I was raised in. And so we come to think of those terms. One of the things I love to explain to people, because I found it so emancipatory, is that Christianity is very strange to offer an afterlife where you keep being you and doing things, meeting up with people. That is,
Mhm.
you cannot find that anywhere. If you find an afterlife at all, it's almost a storage place for if you're needed on earth, you can come up for a minute and haunt that guy or solve this or visit someone. But there's no afterlife like the Christian afterlife. Jewish afterlife's barely mentioned, and it's a kind of we all of our souls are all together in a big one thing, and we're sort of back with God in some sort of way. But nobody's ever sort of looking forward to it. It's not it's not pitched like that. You look at all the religions that believe in karma. Most of them don't believe in what we think of as, our progressive Western idea of karma, where it's, oh yeah, if you hurt someone, you eventually will get paid back because you're putting bad into the world. Yeah, that works, but Hinduism and Buddhism in many countries and many places are absolutely dependent on the idea of a rebirth. You die and you're reborn, but not as you. And only under the most special circumstances do you remember anything at all. So is that an afterlife? It's not an afterlife like the Christian afterlife. And so often when I'm thinking of what we think, I'm thinking of those terms and how much Christianity is very strange and has tricked us into thinking that that's what religion does. And it's really important to notice many religions just tilt people's attention away from death. You just sort of none of your business. None of us are using the minute we're in fully, right? We're trying to get through it somehow. And so it's really better to turn your attention back to where we are than to even think about death. And most religions don't do it as much. So, I really feel like the abyss doesn't exist. It's just an after image of having stared at this strange light of heaven too long. And once you get that idea, it doesn't seem you can look away from it and not be constantly haunted by death.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of it like, well, where do you go after you die? Well, where were you before you were born? Well,
Right.
you weren't anywhere. And most
Right.
people recognize that part. Yeah, yeah, of course I wasn't anywhere. Okay, well, the same thing happens. Well, but for Christianity, they have the problem they have is, what is it that's up there sitting with Jesus and God or whatever? Is it a copy of you now or when you were 30? There's some
Oh,
Christian
yeah.
sect
Yeah.
that, yeah,
Those issues, sure.
yeah.
Which
And
wife do you?
yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Like Julia Sweeney had a bit, like, if I got a nose job, do I have to get my nose back?
Right. Right, right. The nose is kept separately. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah,
But
there
I also
was
point
even a
out
thing with the resurrection that you had to be buried with all your parts, or you
mm,
would not come back with all the parts. So Julia Sweeney might come back with no nose at all, having had it.
right.
Someone having shaved. I don't believe she had one, but in any case. But what were you
Well,
saying?
so she's got her letting go of God monologue is hilarious. This was in the context
I
of the
know.
Mormon,
I love her
yeah,
work. Yeah.
the Mormon boys coming by, and and the blind shall see and the deaf shall hear, and do I get my then she also had
Right.
uterine cancer. Do I get my uterus back? And they go, yeah. She goes, I don't want it back.
The truth is,
Right.
she's been on my mind because enough craziness has been going on in my life that her phrase "and God said ha" keeps going
Oh,
through my mind because it is just like, why is so much happening at once? Even without believing in God, you can laugh that you just sometimes get handed everything at once. Got to deal with it.
so in the bigger picture of your of doubt, what do you attribute the secularization of the West and the rise
Yeah.
of the nuns most recently? What do you think is the cause of this?
Well,
You can
um,
have multiple causes.
sure. No, it's a great question, and not one I immediately address in the book, but it's really fun to talk about. I think that uh, the early 20th century was a fantastic time to be an open, out loud, and proud atheist, whether you were one as your main job, like Robert Ingersoll at the end of the 19th, or whether you were somebody like Thomas Edison, who was in the real world trying to make a living and still willing to say to the New York Times that you don't believe in God, don't believe in an afterlife. Proof, he said. I believe in the material. But what happened was that in the 1950s, in response to godless Russia, uh, our Congress put through in 1956 and 54 that put God on all the money and into the pledge. And it was with the specific argument of separating ourselves from godless Russia. And in the years that followed uh, the Second World War, we got crazy against communism and against atheism, and we shut down Bertrand Russell's publisher. Just an amazing amount of actual stuff got shut down, shuttered, closed. Nobody would take it, and you started to hear it less in novels and in conversation. So, and this is reasonable. I used to always tell the story, and I'll tell it only briefly here, that Elizabeth I didn't make Catholicism illegal until the Spanish Armada comes sailing at her to retake England for the Pope. Now Catholicism goes illegal, and that's what happened here. That it's reasonable that these things happen, and it's also reasonable that as soon as the Twin Towers came down, our most violent relationship, our most virulent enemy, was no longer less religious. Now they were more religious. Now to be American is to be the rationalist, progressive, at least rationalist to keep the markets open, right? Economically rationalist, which you cannot do if everything's blowing up. So I think that that's what happened. I think that, and you can remember with the New Atheists. Of course, my book came out at the same time, but it wasn't quite the same tone. And and uh, Sam
Sam Harris,
Sam Harris, thank you. Sorry, his
Dawkins, Dennett, and Hitchens.
right. His but Harris's book I remember came out specifically saying, "Hey, those planes were religion knocking into America," and that that made it is abundantly clear that it became easier to voice an anti-religious position at that moment. God and Russia was no longer an issue. So, yeah, I don't see that worked out anywhere. I worked it out in doubt. But so much has happened in those 20 years since doubt came out. And it has been really interesting. So what has happened, I think it's continued to be true that the image of the Taliban, the image of ISIS, um, uh, is religion stopping uh, progress and freedom. But But what can we say about America growing less religious, but also more divided, and the right becoming so active? The far right that we didn't even know was there. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe the algorithms created it. Have you ever found yourself falling into an outrage rage? I have had it happen to me where I didn't even
Pretty much
care about
daily.
the issue. Well, I stay away from the stuff. So,
Okay, yeah.
but when I saw myself wanting to tweet and tell everyone, and I suddenly said, I didn't care about this yesterday. I fell into some issue, and I said, "Oh, the rage is fun." I'd read the books about how the rage was fun, the algorithm books, one carefully and looked at others, but enough to say, "Oh, it's happening to me." They're right. They got more of my engagement because I got very angry in a way that I think goes back to some group protection kind of thing evolutionarily, because your rational mind is gone, and suddenly you want to go fight someone when you wanted to have lunch 20 minutes ago. Like, what? It's very powerful outrage. I try to steer clear of it in every way. I try not to create outrage nor experience it, because I don't think it leads to good results. And right now, I think it's really, I mean, we all know, I'm learning from other people how much it's hurting America, because extremes are what keep people engaged. But how does it work that a country that was always separated in many ways, with religion on one side and progressive secularism on the other side, how does it work out now that suddenly that's not really the map? We don't know what to make of religious people embracing Trump. Right? It's still confusing. It still makes people on the left say, "Oh, we thought they believed what they were saying, and now we're not sure." Though, of course, there's other arguments that they were just willing to use any army to get to their goal. But yeah, very troubling. So I think absolutely the political system is still allowing smart young people to feel okay saying that they don't believe and they aren't religious. I also think probably social media is allowing us all to make friends in a different place. I remember the first time I visited some churches, but I visited one of the mega churches, just because I was giving a talk somewhere in the middle of the country and they told me there was one. I was interested. We don't have them on the East
Yeah.
Coast.
Oh,
And
it's a show. It's big.
it's a show. Wow. And it's not just, oh, we're gathering because we're lonely. On the East Coast, you do think of these churches as it's the only thing that gets some people out of house in Vermont in the winter, right? They go to church on Sunday. But yeah, these mega churches with the band and the singing and the rock and roll for Jesus and everybody with the hands up. I tried hands up, see how it feels. I get it, and you can see why these people are showing up. Well, are they still showing up with the internet as an alternative? I don't know. I think for sure religion was always a reasonable human creation for social interaction, and I think that the combination of the pandemic and the extraordinary rise of the internet, yeah, I think maybe that's a little part of why the people who aren't religious, can survive without it. Because you do need interaction.
All
You
right,
do need something.
yeah. Couple thoughts. I just had Naomi Oreskes on the podcast. Her new book is called The Big Myth. The big myth being that the free market can solve all social problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so she has a whole chapter on how Jesus became a capitalist. Basically, post World War II, the right realized we need religion. We need the churches in our side. And they kind of turned these church gatherings and prayer breakfasts into political opportunities. That led to the rise of the religious right and the moral majority and Reagan and all that. And I think that's come to an end now. I think with Trump, it was clear, we don't really care about religious principles in our leaders. We just want the judges, we can get to overturn Roe v. Wade. That's our thing. That's, I think, what I was told about Trump when I asked a group of Christians at a church with Dinesh D'Souza I was doing this debate with.
Ah, fascinating.
how could you possibly support Trump? I mean, this is like the
Yeah,
least Christian president we've ever had
yeah,
since Thomas Jefferson, maybe.
right. And they talked
Uh,
about
and they
the
basically said,
babies.
well, God chooses flawed characters in the Bible, and it's he's going to get us the judges we want, and we're not choosing a religious. We already have a savior. He's Jesus. We don't want Trump to be our savior. We want him to do what we want him to do. Something like that. So I think that's come full circle. And then we're seeing the rise. I had Elle Hardy on. Her book is called Beyond Belief, about the rise of Pentecostalism, which I had no idea. Worldwide, it's like 600 million. It's huge. And I think maybe what you went to had a touch of the Pentecostalism. There's a lot of up and down and singing and all the talking in tongues. I don't know if they did that where you were at, but it's very but it's completely different than the moral majority kind of Southern Baptist. Everybody sits quietly in the pews and listens to
Hmm.
the presentation, something like that. I think that's maybe we've seen a sea shift, and maybe centrist people, regular rational people that would otherwise maybe go with religion, see all this craziness, and think, you know what, I'm just have no religious affiliation.
Yeah, it's. I think everything you say is right. And they all add up to it not being an obvious step. And when it's not an obvious step to get out of bed on Sunday and go in, uh, there are other things a lot of people want to do. And if there's other ways to be with
Yeah.
people and all of that,
Do you know
it's
the
going to happen.
Dorothy Parker line about why she doesn't go to church Sunday mornings? Because I'm too fucking busy, and vice versa.
Right. Yeah, she was quite the card.
Yes.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
everything we're talking about is sort of about what do people need in their lives,
Right.
right?
Yes. Yes. Right. Right.
And so if we look at rational people doing something that feels irrational, it makes sense to say, well, they're hungry for something, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that's definitely, well, even when I wrote Doubt, the reason the book got big is because it wasn't just this person says no, this person says no, this person says no. They all had visions of how to live without religion or without God or without whatever aspect of it, without rebirth. They had been counting on before, and they make up new ways of thinking about things. And yeah, I had to make those clear in Doubt because there were so many wonderful ideas about what to make sacred in your life. Mostly family or friends or philosophy or the forwarding of science or the forwarding of an equal society. Big ideas. Um, Bertrand Russell sort of landed on no nukes personally. That he wrote in the Conquest of Happiness how certain kinds of of political fights, social fights, where it's going to go on after your death, can really, for him, he was describing, and it sounded right to me, that he really stopped worrying so much about death after he became part of a movement that was larger than himself. That was a life and death human movement. So I think that in general. And then the reason I wrote this book is because uh, people need a lot of the stuff that we built into religion in this world where you and I are talking. A lot of the time, that means it's built into Christianity. So, and in some ways, you can see capitalism as redoubling this because it starts to be the only place that we talk about things outside of money. Are the university. Once you're in a class, maybe you care about Homer and you're all discussing, the richness of deep ideas. Uh, but it seemed to me that the um, way we all interact with art is um, it can fill a lot of the places in our hearts that people think need to be filled by religion, as I was starting to say, because capitalism really chased away everything that could be sold is sold. And so, people feel if you go into a church, you could put your purse down and walk away and come back because you believe that within that architecture, human beings will behave differently. And you're right to, because a person would feel more guilty stealing a purse in a church, right? Um, uh, I think you'd still watch it, but at a big wedding, I know we all just feel like no one would steal from a wedding, and but it's that religious specialness. And so I have been on the lookout for these 20 years of ways that normal people out there are negotiating the things that they might be lacking, because everything that was sort of human, all the singing and all the arranged talking and all the gathering, had sort of gotten closed into the church. So now if we're not going there, we have to not worry about the politics of, look, they here's some atheists who like religion. Okay. There are going to be atheists who hate every aspect of religion. Quite frankly, I'm glad they exist. Okay. I think religion is very often very dangerous, and it gets very powerful when it gets established because of the supernatural piece. And so I'm very glad there are fiery atheists out there. And I think that we have to be careful about how much we would borrow from religion. We don't want to become a religion. But to know that human beings seem to need moments of reflection, and we're all doing that on our own or suffering the lack of it, to my mind. And many of us, a poem crosses our desk on the internet in a random way a couple times a week, and we might read it and we might feel something from it. You click like, though, usually, and you move on. Even if you save it, when do you go back? And so I'm really saying that poetry can help in two different ways. One is the way that is the most general. I'm saying a poetic approach to life is a slight alternative from a fully scientific one. And it is pretty separate from a religious one, because a poetic standpoint, as I'm defining it, is absolutely not supernatural, or it goes into the religion bucket. But where do you put love if all we have is a science bucket and a religion bucket? You end up just saying, well, they think it's this, but we can define it. But when we have our white lab coats on, we explain things away. But you can't explain it away by explaining it. You can explain it. Spatial symmetry suggests a healthy breeding partner, but that's not how we experience it, right? Love and heartbreak throttle us no matter how smart we think we are, and as does grief. These are huge physical human things. We live within the human world, and a lot of things that we can talk about scientifically, we experience in this really human way, which is sloppy and crazy. And poetry is a sort of brief visit to a psychological shift in mind, where you're just a little bit more aware of the weirdness of our material position. To have consciousness and be a material thing, to have ambition and to be a mortal thing, those are two crazy things. The fact that the meat thinks is so paradoxical.
I love that line in your book. The meat thinks.
The meat thinks. By paradoxical, just to be clear for people, we mean paradoxical, that two pieces of truth that don't cohere. They don't go together. They cancel each other out, but they don't, because they're both true. And you think of a piece of meat, you pinch yourself and see what that is. Could that think? Except that thinks. It's done all the thinking. We've created all the music and all the books and the whole astounding modern world with these balls of goo in our heads. It doesn't make rational sense that consciousness of this level should leap out of balls of goo. There's no reason to add a mystery to that and say God did it. It's mysterious enough just like that. And it doesn't get less mysterious if you say God did it, right? Like, what does that add? So for me, the simple fact that for reasons we can discuss in science class and are fascinating endlessly to me, we developed these brains, and these brains give us this very strange life experience. And that we can deal with in poetry, where we talk about the strangeness of everything, but we don't add anything else on. Um, and yeah.
Right. So people talk about religion filling a need. I mean, like people that study religion, psychologists and so on. But it's like the fact we have a need for sex and intimacy, physical intimacy, doesn't mean we have to have a Playboy club in every city, right? That's just one of countless, things that could be an avenue to express it, something like that. And even that appears to be a dead idea now. But, after the whole Dawkins new atheist stuff, there was much discussion in atheist, humanist, skeptical circles. Do we need to replace religion? If we're successful, do we need to replace religion? A lot of humanists, like I remember Paul Kurtz, who founded Psychop and the Free Inquiry and the two magazines and so on. But, he gave me his little I Have a Dream speech. We're going to have a secular church in every city, and we're going to have baptisms and weddings and funerals and babysitting and, free parking,
Yeah.
just like religion.
Yeah.
And I gather the point from your book is maybe, okay, but you don't have to do all that. You can just find it in your life right now.
Right. Very much so. My book is much more trying to read what people are doing already, or rather, I couldn't help seeing what I was seeing and thinking what I was thinking over these 20 years. But the book is not telling people to do anything new, though it encourages them to think about some new possibilities in a lot of different directions. But really, I'm saying you probably already go to a couple of religious things a year. And you do it for family or friends, or because you yourself can't think of another way to get married or whatever it is, or somebody dies, you hadn't done the planning, somebody wants to have a funeral, next thing you know, there's a priest talking, and it doesn't make sense for you. But we go to these things. There is always the classic image of the village atheist who won't even go to the office Christmas party. But most of us aren't that guy. Most of us go, but we might feel a little sad. People have reported to me that they feel a little sad at all of these sorts of things, either because they were born into two different religions and not the one that's being celebrated, or that they just don't believe any of it, and they feel that the people who believe are getting something out of it that they're not, and that they're invisible, and they feel like it would just be better if it was really something that addressed them and included them. And yet we go to them. And so what I'm suggesting is that we think of those trips as part and parcel of what we do when we go to art museums, or go listen to music, or do other things to take care of our sort of inner life. And you don't have to add much to that other than the thought of it, the thought that there are a lot of us out here. And it's sort of helpful to make explicit that there's I invent the term the interfaithless.
I like that.
I laughed at first when I thought of it. I was like, oh, I can't really use that. But, there are so many of us from different religions. In America, every Christianity is different. I mean, boy, there are so many different types of belief that you meet when you sit around with friends and talk about where they came from. But they could have any number of religions that people came from. And what if there's 2 in every crowd of 10, or 5 in every crowd of 10 who doesn't believe but is there for any of those reasons? And if you just have a little bit of a sense of the part of that interfaithless, that there's all of us out here, but that we're a little bit together and we want the best for each other. It doesn't have to be a congregation that like tithes to feel a little bit of community, a little bit of congregation. The other people out here who have decided on a different way of living, And a lot of us are living to try to make the world better. And it's just part of, it's not all of us, but a lot of us.
Would
Yeah.
secular Judaism be an example of this? Because every Jew I know, because I'm in academia and science and so on,
Mm-hmm.
they don't believe in God. They're atheists or agnostics,
Mm-hmm.
but they're practicing. I mean, they do the ceremonies and the holidays
Yes.
and so on. So it's more of a cultural, historical, sacred kind of just rituals. What do you call it? Liturgical kind of process.
It's absolutely true. But it could have gone a different way. There's a novelist who was very popular in the early 20th century, Peter de Vries, who in one of his books, he talks about the atheist Christian and he wants to knock on doors. He starts the book believing, and a sister of his dies. Um, I'm pretty sure I read the book over 10 years ago, but uh, it's either a sister or a brother, and he meets someone who lost the other. Anyway, he makes it explicit. No God would do that. He loses faith for a bunch of different reasons, but finally that's when he's just done. But then he wants to keep some of the tenets of Christianity that he grew up with. He's aware that you can't just say Christianity because people believe a lot of different things, but what he was raised believing it as. And yeah, he wanted to knock on doors and sell Christian atheism, which I found charming because you don't see that. What you do see is Jewish atheism. In fact, most of us in the U.S. are in New York, and most of the New York Jews don't believe. Yes, it's because there's an ethnicity involved, which is historical, and for historical reasons. And there are historical reasons that as such a tight ethnicity is loosening up a little bit. But yeah, it's a model of a certain kind of continuing religion without belief. Um, it's a little tricky because it's a kind of a closed religion, a little. It's really speaking to its own, which means that it's not evangelistic, which is nice. But on the other hand, um, I think that some of its tenacity is the idea that that we're a group, a special group. And I'm not sure how healthy that is. I get it, but if I heard about it in a different group, I'd say, "Oh, loosen up." That sounds a little like it's bordering on not cool, you know.
But
And,
you wouldn't. But if
uh,
you heard a Christian say, "Well, I don't really believe Jesus died for our sins. I don't even think he was resurrected," then the response would be, "Then why are you a Christian?" I mean, that's the whole point. That's the central dogma of
yeah.
Christianity. What are you
And I
doing?
only meet I do meet Christians who don't believe that stuff. But they're very progressive, and they say that's the God is love type.
I see.
Um,
Yes, right, right.
and they don't
So they like the
hold any.
message of Jesus that we should take care of the poor and the needy and so on.
Yep, just that. And God is love. And I show up to my meetings, or some Christian meetings are as quiet as as the Quaker kind of vision of Christianity. Yeah. So, and look, I've met a lot of believers, and I've never found one who believes absolutely everything what their church told them to believe. People are so willing to be like, "Oh yeah, the church believes that, but that can't be true." I can't believe how much they all interpret on their own, but they do. They really are. And I think it's great because of the creativity of the human mind. We just
Right.
doubt what we doubt and move on.
But see, fundamentalists will say, "Oh, those are cafeteria Christians, right? They're just
Maybe
picking and
so, but
choosing."
I've never met one who believed everything when I started asking questions. No,
Interesting. Yeah.
they all say,
Yeah, yeah.
"Well, yeah, the church believes that," but I mean, really, not cafeteria, really serious believers, but who have some complicated idea about purgatory or some strange thing that isn't in the direct doctrine. I'm just saying it's interesting that it's not just non-believers who are trying to figure it out on their own, who suffer the lack of a certain kind of help. Religious people all the time tell me that the help that they get when they're feeling okay is not always available to them when they're feeling terrible, that they drop into depression as bad as anybody else. That was a surprise to me. I talk about that one in the book just
Yeah.
briefly. That, yeah, I was so uh, familiar, comfortable with the idea that religion was a crutch, that to hear that the crutch disappears when the person needs it the most was sort of moving, just to say, all right, people are interesting and I can't guess what they're going through. I have to ask every time. You really can't guess. I can't guess. But yeah, I found that what that what I've done with the wonder paradox is to suggest that people pick out maybe 10 poems that they could go back to, or that they could turn to if someone died and they needed a grief poem, or a poem if they wanted to read one on Christmas, to know that they had this poem to sort of. And a lot of Christmas poems are not very happy poems. They're poems about how everyone else is having a happy time, but I'm not. Like, when would you have time to write a poem if you're feeling happy, right? You're having a good time. It's when you're left out that you write that poem. But
That's
boy,
funny.
does that help when everybody feels a little left out, even if they're the person at the center of a celebration, right? That's the human experience. We're all ambivalent. So the poetry is always ambivalent. That's its one true factor. There's no good poem that doesn't have some agony in it. That's what we're doing as poets. We're trying to represent the unrepresentable, and that at its first blush is, I feel this way and also that way. I know this is true. Oh my God, I also sense this is true. I better mention it, at least as something I'm rejecting. So
Maybe
what I'm
instead of
saying,
thinking of it
no.
as like an empirical truth, we should
Mm.
think of it as a mythical truth or a religious truth. That's a different kind of claim than
Oh,
a
sure.
scientific truth. So here you might invoke Joseph Campbell, or if you like a more recent example, Jordan Peterson. Whether Jesus was resurrected from the dead or not is sort of beside the point. You're missing the point of the story. This is how you might think of it mythic. It's mythically true, right? It's a proxy for other
Yeah.
beliefs that
Okay.
we
I mean, it's
stand
worth
at.
saying he didn't. He didn't rise from the dead. People don't rise from the dead, and he didn't, right?
Yes.
You know
Well,
that,
I
right?
think so. It's
Yeah.
100 billion to 1 that he did. That's how I
No, I'm
calculated
finished. No, I don't
it.
need any new information that maybe a little Jewish boy 2,000 years ago got up after he died. No, thank you. I'm good.
Right. But so what is it that Christians get out of believing that that happened?
Well, I've heard many very rational people tell me that they love the story and that they're trying to believe. They even tell me that they have, that they'll say the Jesus prayer, which is actually an Eastern Orthodox thing of doing a great deal of repeating short lines. And they're working hard to believe a story that they like a lot. That is what I've been told. Sometimes asking me directly to please not disturb their wanting to believe something that's not true. And um, the only way to imagine that it's maybe true is if it was the only great story out there. And I think that they sell themselves this idea. I think they tell themselves that the other religions are going to catch up. I think it is offensive, frankly, to believe that the other religions are behind Christianity and they're going to get there. And so you have to look around and say, if you're going by numbers, you better get with the Hindus and the Muslims. You're not necessarily in good shape with the Christians. And if you're not going by numbers, which would be absurd, um, you know, there are too many other good stories out there for that to be a reasonable. I always say with my belief, my non-belief in God or the supernaturalism, I do see a few arguments for supernaturalism. One is consciousness. If there were no other beings on the planet but us, I would say all this thought couldn't go nowhere. Maybe it persists after the body is dead, but there are billions of ants and flies and worms. Are we suggesting that they have an afterlife? And if not, or that a god is doing their thinking for them as a little tickle in the brain, if the fact of so many conscious creatures makes it very obvious to me that we have developed here on this planet. Among these other conscious beings, there's just no reason to think anything else. And when you step on these beings, there's no chance that these beings are going someplace fancy afterwards. And no chance we are either. And the fact that anybody thinks so is so obviously a kind of, there's a difference between mistake, illusion, and delusion. And you can tell delusion because it serves your interests. Though I don't think this one does. We can say, oh, I don't want to die, and I get that. I certainly don't want the people I love to die. But the fact of death is it's probably easier to thrive, to be a powerful, free individual person if you're dealing with facts that you believe are bedrock facts. And to believe that death is not death is to fiddle with one of the real major facts on our plate. And I think it's cognitive dissonance that you create. And every time you are shocked into realizing death is death, you're on your own. Whereas if you get used to the idea, either through walking in forests or poetry, either one will remind you that death is not a glitch in the program that we have to run and fix, but rather this whole thing, this whole experience on planet Earth is just death mushrooms life, death mushrooms life. That's what's going on here. And yeah, I see the reasons to lament it if you're in the mood to lament, but the situation is what it is. People, as I said, they don't seem to be taking advantage of the life they have. They do seem tired. So the idea of rejecting death this strenuously seems like the wrong direction to look in. It's better to just say, okay, that's what we're dealing with, and then go live life, not thinking about death all the time, being good because it makes you feel good.
Well, so the argument is the fact that there's an end to life it gives additional meaning to the days and years you have. But if you think this is just a temporary staging area before the big show, then that lessens the value of what we're experiencing now. Just to put a fine point on it, people, I think, are still kind of natural-born duelists. They still think of mind as some kind of substance that floats off the brain and goes into the ether somewhere when you die. Right. But it's a process. It's not. The mind is just a word we use to describe what the brain does. The brain processes stuff. So it'd be like asking, when my heart stops beating, where does the heartbeat go? It does. What are you talking about? It doesn't go anywhere. It's the process that we're talking about. So that can't possibly continue.
The Buddha answered when people asked about an afterlife. He said that's like asking where the flame goes after we blow it out, to the east or west.
Exactly. Yeah,
it's
I love
no,
that.
we can't tell you east or west. You're asking the wrong question.
Right. So here you quote from Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass, that you are here, that life exists in identity, that the powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse. You may contribute a verse, you write. Take part, but be creative. Why shouldn't your honest encounter with the Abrahamic tradition be as valid as any made by interpreters of the past, and so on? Yeah, so I was just thinking about Christopher Hitchens. He wrote those great series of essays on his deathbed, basically, and you can now read them all in a single book. But his analogy was, it's imagine you're at a party and you're tapped on the shoulder. You have to leave the party now. It's like, oh no. And worse, the party's going to go on without you. Oh no. But then he comes back and says, but what if we reversed it? What if you got tapped on the shoulder and says, you can never leave the party? It's like, well, wait a minute. I don't want to be at this party for eternity. I mean, what does that even mean? Right. So the fact that there's an end makes every step in between now and then more meaningful. That is
what we argue because we're stuck with death. And I believe it because I'm stuck with death. I mean, if I had the choice of pressing a button for 20 more years, I might press it forever. Right. I think he's right that if handed forever, I would know I've seen enough Dracula movies to know that's not that people don't like it. But And the whole eastern half of the world, their idea of heaven is to finally stop coming back here and reach nirvana and pop out of existence, right? So accepting that one can be done with existence. But like I said, if I had a 20-year button to push, I'm going to push the button. I don't want to die. Is my body, if my body gets old and old and old, would I eventually push the button? Yeah, you hear that from old people, right? Please push the button. But if your body could stay okay, I would take mine where it is right now, though I'd go back a few years if I could. But yeah, if you could push the button 20 more years in this body, I might push it forever. But that's not the deal. Okay, so and if I was told that there's a chance we could get to immortality if we put all our eggs for, I wouldn't do that. But if there's a button, sure, I'm not crazy. I want to live. I want to see what happens next. I have all those, instincts that we all have to want to stay. However, the body seems to take care of this. As you get much older, you do seem to separate a little bit from the things you cared about. It does seem like if you go through the natural phase without a disease coming to get you before you're done. I mean, remember Hitchens, I don't remember the details, but his father had died
Mm-hmm.
just a little younger than he did of the
Mm-hmm.
same disease
Same cancer.
caused by the same drinking and smoking that
Yeah.
he then did to excess and with great, you know, panache. He would shove it in your face. Oh, you don't drink? I do, and,
He said
and
the candle burns at both ends, and what a lovely light it shone. He got that from somebody else. I forget who the
yes, yeah,
poet was, but yeah.
um, yeah, uh, and that's, yeah, I mean, there's no, uh, just the fact that, I don't know. I don't know exactly where I was going, but it certainly looks like
Since
but I want to
let's
finish just the little notion that he did not run from death. I
right.
know that cigarettes and alcohol can feel like a break from life in life, but he's a very smart man. He certainly knew he was inviting death into the room. So that's, a different kind of question to ask, because if you really believe in death, there's the question of, does it matter when it comes, and does it matter when you leave the room? And yeah, I'm heartened by some death scenes I've read, of modern people who don't believe, but who have been felled by a disease and in the hospital surrounded by friends. And they seem to, by the time they get to hospice, some of them are okay with it. It's hard, it's a hard one, but it doesn't have to be papered over. It's not that hard. It's it's too true to be that hard. It's the situation. It's like why being upset that you're not much, much taller. I mean, you're not, this is what it is. This is the deal. And it seems I often find that it's children who think of death as the most frightening and they're farthest away from it, right? As we get a little closer, we start to ride the body as we rode it into adolescence and suddenly had different feelings. As we get older, we also have different feelings, and it doesn't make sense to worry about it now. One of the things I talk about in my secular argument against suicide in my last book, Stay, and I talk about here too, is now I've lost my train of thought. How did I do that?
Suicide,
Um,
death.
Suicide, death,
You're
and
against suicide, but what about if somebody's totally miserable? Just
oh, no, if you get one person to agree with you, you're a different category. I'm really asking people to just find one person to agree with them that they're done. Most of the time, it's a solo decision that even you in a different mood would be pissed at.
we do know
So
that
find
that's true.
one guy.
People that try to kill themselves and fail almost inevitably say, "I don't know what I was thinking. Thank God somebody
That is right.
intervened."
The vast majority are very glad that it didn't happen, right? And we know that because they don't try again. The vast
Right,
majority don't
right.
try again, and and interviewed will tell you. Um, but yeah, that's that's an almost silly limitation, and yet I stand by it. If you are mentally ill or physically ill, and a doctor and maybe one person who loves you both say, "My goodness, you have been through it. If you want to be done, you should be done." You're in a different category than I'm talking about with stay.
Mm,
With stay, I'm
yeah.
really talking about what studies have shown is not even a result of depression. It's more depressed people are very often don't kill themselves. They're too tired. But people who have suffered a major setback in work or love for 3 months afterwards, they're very vulnerable. If you make it past the 3 months, you're very unlikely to kill yourself over it. And yeah, so having read all these things, yeah, I try to make it clear to people that you can be your own guard against letting your worst mood kill all your others. But yeah, I'm certainly not talking about end of life care.
This is
Not at all.
your chapter 7. How are we supposed to talk about death without religion? So, what is your answer to that question? And more specifically, like atheist,
Yeah,
if you're at a funeral and somebody says, "Well, it's okay. He's in a better place, and we're going to see
right,
him again, and he's up there with Jesus or whatever." I'm not going to say anything like, that's all bullshit, right? I'm not going to be a dick
right,
about
right.
it. But what do you say, and what would I say at somebody's funeral who didn't believe in God and so on? How do you think about that?
Well, again, poetry is very useful because it one of its talents is that it opens a lot of questions and ideas without closing anything down. And so you can offer a poem to someone and they can't exactly reject it. There's not a message being said to them. Nobody's trying to get their vote. But if you hear beautiful words that have a convincing idea that love remains in the heart, um, and that uh, the point of life, given that we are all going to die, has to be something farther away than who's alive right now. And there are lots of poems that um, make people feel better or at least differently about the fact of loss. And that's why we read poems at funerals. We're trying to help, we're trying to express something. I certainly have been around nominal believers who at funerals reject God and reject, well, not maybe not God, but they reject the heaven. Like they won't tolerate it in that moment. They want the person here now and they are pissed, and the idea, oh, I'm going to join him up there. They're a little willing to say bullshit in that moment when you'd think they'd need the most, then come back to them in 2 months and maybe a leaf landed in a special way and they're ready to see that as their person, giving them a sign or something. And I'm not against that, by the way. I don't believe it is the person, but I like the fact that it seems to me that we could talk about rational ghosts in the sense that when we know somebody very well, we're learning them. And when they're gone, they're no longer doing anything new. So we sort of know everything that we're going to know. And they somehow kind of sometimes take up residence in our heads or in our hearts and start talking to us. But that's because we've memorized them. And why not let a rationalist know that, yeah, you're that person, you might lose them. But if you do, you might get them even more than you had them before. No, it's not really them, but it is them a little. You've memorized them. You know what they would say in this instance. And I think that there are ways that we could talk about some of these things that are true, but we haven't put words to. Um, I really have, I think, 3 different chapters that you could call How Do We Deal with Death chapters, because it is such a big part of religion, especially Christianity, which is the sea I'm writing from. And yeah, one of the chapters is how to talk about heavenlessness with children, because I have met atheists who were as devoted to the cause as you and I. People who have, well, maybe not as you and I. You and I are real special in it, but people who are devoted to the cause. They buy the magazines and they care about atheism, secularism, separation of church and state, and then when their kid gets upset about death, suddenly all that strength, which, they can be really almost cocky about not caring about their own death. Um, but when it comes to their kid, the kid fearing their own death, and everybody else is, uh, people really get stuck. I certainly felt somewhat stuck when it happened to me, with one of my kids,
What
really
happened?
upset. Just found out about death, got really
Oh, sorry.
upset. He was just a
Mm,
little guy. And,
right.
uh, you know, uh, my husband is an ex-Catholic and I'm an atheist Jew. And what were we going to say to this very small person who still, now he's grown up and he thinks a little bit about the computer science version of possibly getting out of death, right? Uploading brains. Okay. Um, but yeah, I wasn't going to lie to him. I hadn't lied to him yet, and I wasn't going to lie to him, and I didn't know what to do. And it was a really desperate situation until I thought of something awfully simple, which was just to say, you'll understand it better when you're older. I know it seems almost silly to make a big chapter about it, but kids, you don't make up a god for the fact that kids don't want to get married and think the opposite sex is yucky. You just say, just wait. When you're 18, you're going to feel differently. And the kid says, oh, and moves on. You ever have a kid follow you around and say, I don't want to ever get married? You say, drop it. Or they don't want to work. And you say, you don't have to work for a while. And when you get older, yes, it's hard. Yes, mommy and daddy complain all the time, but you get money and you get independence. You could do whatever you want. And the kid says, oh, okay, when I grow up, that'll makes enough sense. The death thing is for grown-ups and maybe not for untrained grown-ups. Maybe you have to read some literature and some poetry and watch how people get over it and how people negotiate it. And everybody has a slight different twist. Human beings are very creative. If you just go by the things you hear, in the big books, you're just going to hear the tip of the iceberg. People make a lot of different ways of making peace with the past and moving into the future. And usually they feel guilty about it. And really, my book, in a lot of ways, is saying, here's why you're doing the exact right thing. We're all creating the next world, and let's create it together. Let's feel like this is a space where we can think about um, how we have in common all these good feelings, and we wish each other well. I I'm very much on the left. Most of my life, communism didn't exist in this country. You couldn't say you were socialist or communist, but I always felt like capitalism was problematic. I well, raised Jewish on the East Coast. That was a basic, Bernie Sanders comes from us. That's our boobies and our grandparents talking about that. And they were fighting for, equality. They were all on the far left. Old Jews aren't all on the far left anymore. Now I meet some with money who want to vote for their pocketbooks. But when I was growing up, it seemed like good people, our people, were far on the left. Now I see a left that is so complicated and confusing. I'm really glad there's a left that seems farther left than me. I was way out on the edge at one point. But yeah, so um, what was the question?
Oh, we were talking. I was going to bring up. You probably met Pat Lindsay here, right above my
Uh-huh. Yes.
shoulder here. Well, she died last year, and I'm kind of keeping her alive. I think we
Mm-hmm.
still have the magazine. Her artwork is all over my office here,
I love that.
and what else can you do, right? I mean, the memory, the influence, the effects. Her voice in my head. What would
Yeah.
Pat say now? That kind of
But
stuff.
I'll say
I mean,
something even
it
larger,
is
just
isn't that should be good enough, right? I mean,
well,
because
yes, but it doesn't. There's one more piece, which is what help was it when we thought God was watching? Like, why did it feel like, oh, it's being recorded? Whatever's happening, it's in the can. It's being seen. And and I think it's interesting to directly ask oneself how if it felt like something was being made just because someone was watching. Isn't it kind of true that something was being made anyway? That the story of humanity is a rich, beautiful thing she took part in with great vigor. And she doesn't even really need you remembering her because she was here, man. And anybody who got into the great lottery of existence, right? All those egg and sperm cells somehow meeting each other, not getting killed by lions. And here we are, unbelievably lucky to be here. And she took life and really did something with it. And that is in the can. That has been seen by us all with our little cameras these days, watching each other. But it's also just true that the story of humanity is a worthwhile, beautiful thing to join, to take part in, to believe in the good, to believe in virtue, to try. All those things are poetic ideas. We do not lose them when we lose God. Why was she fighting for something so good if she wasn't doing it, under the banner of a God or religion? Because humanity matters. It's just we don't have enough language to talk about it right now, but it's important.
I'll read Richard Dawkins'
Mm.
1998 Unweaving the Rainbow. This is a classic passage. We are going to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. Most people are never going to die because they're never going to be
Mhm.
born. The potential people who could have been here in my place, but who will in fact never see the light of day, outnumber the sand grains of Arabia. Certainly, these unborn ghosts include greater poets than Keats, scientists greater than Newton. We know this because the set of possible people allowed by our DNA so massively exceeds the set of
Mm.
actual people. In the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I in our ordinariness that are here.
Mhm.
That's just
Yeah.
great. That's, to me,
It is
that's
a beauty,
poetry.
and I'm glad to say I've heard it, and I hope that it is something that runs through the community that people know of, and I think it's a beautiful, beautiful passage, and it is one of these great reminders that if we're gonna feel sad about death, we ought to remember remember what we got. If you got one life in, that's something I talk about in the book, different ways of realizing um, that it's also important to accept that we get one life and that there are different kinds of adventures you can go on. If you try to go on all of them, that's its own separate thing. But most of us pick something and really get into it and try, because if you're go flying around all the time, you're not writing books or raising healthy children or starting an institution, um, or you're out traveling and doing that, but you get one life, and it doesn't make sense to lament what you don't do. It makes sense to see that you made a choice. You got in, you got a life, you're doing something, and there was no other way. You were only gonna do one life, one way or the other. And so it's really best to stop thinking about how many paths there are and and see how lucky you are to have a path and how smart you were to have built yourself some sort of a platform to stand on. And most of us have, and we can go forward from there. And in another chapter, I look at a very similar kind of question, but from the other direction of looking back and having regrets, and how um, you can process those so that you can realize that they added up to something good in a lot of cases, especially if you had children or did anybody a world of good since your disaster. Many times our disasters make us kinder and we saved somebody. And you look back and you say, well, without the disaster, I don't save that guy. And so it's all worth it. It's really remarkable. Helping other people, I mean, it sounds so like obvious, but when other people are in existential distress, I'm suddenly able to sell them life, and then I'm in existential distress and I know help someone else is my way out.
Remember the Jimmy
Certainly, yeah.
Stewart movie, It's a Wonderful Life, where he has a replay and
Sure.
the angel Clarence takes him out of the sequence and he sees how bad life was without him for the people he knew. And that,
That's
you
right.
never know the difference you're making, these little tiny things from day to day
Right.
until it's gone. And then you're like,
Right.
oh, that
Right,
little
and
thing I
and
did
people
right there
often
mattered.
say in time travel movies, how important it is not to change anything.
Mhm.
And it should highlight for us, you're living right now in your own timeline. Change something.
Yeah, right.
Change something. Be
Right.
insanely generous one day. If you're, this is something I use. I didn't put this in the book, but when I'm waiting for an email, I try to remember that someone's waiting for an email from me. Again, I'm not actually expecting anything magical, but I write back to someone. Like I try to say, oh, what is it I want from the world? Is there someone who I can give that to? And it changes my mood, That's not something in the book, but the book is about um, different people's kind of folk wisdom. Maybe I won't use that term. It plays down just the intelligence of normal people in outrageous situations. Why should a teenager who just lost his father have to sit in the pews and have half the people in his family think he's dead in the ground, rotting and not coming back, and the other half think this heaven thing, and he doesn't know what to think? He's grieving his father. He should have one or the other. I mean, he should have something. I feel very strongly he should have the truth, and that it's insane to put someone on this crazy planet and not have them have at least the physics we know. You're going to lie to them about the physics?
That's great. All right, let's talk about morality and meaning.
Yeah.
The sense you get from religious people is that without an outside source that says this is right and wrong, or this is the purpose of life, or worse, the cosmic courthouse sense, like, Hitler if there's no God, then Hitler got away with it. The Holocaust didn't mean anything. It's just, and I've heard William Lane Craig make this argument, if the universe just ends in a heat death 14 billion years from now, or whatever, then none of this mattered. The Holocaust, nothing mattered. It's all just shit just goes on. And
that person was way too dependent on the idea that God was doing the mattering. If you take that piece out, you look around and there's lots of places in the world that lived without a monotheist God, and they had their own reasons for living and dying. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this thing, but the key major point is that to say that is to be still very hung up on God. If you think that this daddy guy came in and brought the meaning and brought the watching, and then he leaves and you got no meaning left, yeah, you're in trouble. But I see meaning everywhere. We have too much meaning. Think of how many people have all these different desires for good meaning. We can't all even get anything done. We have a lot of meaning. Justice is harder. I'll give you that. And you brought up justice with Hitler and the Holocaust, and I'm afraid that that is, to my understanding, I've actually never even tried to think of that. I don't think it ever occurred to me that religious people have a benefit there. They can believe that Hitler personally will be somehow punished for the Holocaust enough to make the Holocaust have made sense. Nope, rejected out of hand. Nope. Nope. God comes down and says he's the keeper of morality. I say, you tell me why the babies suffer right now. Tell me about the tsetse babies that Mark Twain was worried about, that I wrote about in Doubt. Because he said, I don't know about a God, Twain did, but if he exists, he's evil, because this is evil. This is bad. Um, I cannot imagine how saying God is the keeper of morality or meaning helps me any at all. I did grow up with a sense that my mom, when I was growing up, I don't think she thinks this now, but that there is an afterlife, that there is a God, and that he'll spill some tea. We'll get some answers, and I wanted that, and that pissed me off when I sort of came to rationalism. I was like, gosh, okay, I was hoping for some big answers. But yeah, you then realize that you can love the questions and live the questions, and morality is also. I think people think morality has to come from God, partially because we said it did, right? But
well,
the
the
idea
argument
that
is that
morality.
the argument is that if there's no God, then it's just purely culturally determined. Your culture says slavery is bad. My
Sure.
culture says it's fine. Who really
Right.
knows?
Well, my experience is that we all know how you're supposed to treat a human being, and we just differ on who's a human being.
Mm.
Um, and that seems to be an evolutionary component, right? It seems really hardwired that we're group centered. And I do think that if we've managed to make Americans all feel like one person, one type of thing,
Right.
right? That's 300 million people. And we would all cry if somebody ruined America. You know what I mean? Like, we care about being Americans. So I think we could care about being human beings. Um, Obviously, we don't care about all Americans, right? When we get down into the nitty gritty, even in your own family, that sometimes you care about yourself instead of them. I mean, it's hard, but yeah. So morality, I think we do know how you're supposed to treat a human being. We differ about who it gets included into that group. Um, you know, Obviously, I'm not 100%. There are people who think different things are pleasant, but um, yes, that's my point. Morality is not written in stone. It's hilarious that Moses comes down with it written in stone, because the most important thing about morality, like love, is that you have to sort it out all the time. Morality, you are on any given day, you have to choose a whole bunch of different things to do that could hurt the earth, the planet, or other people, or benefit other people in different ways. And you choose a path every day. Um, the feeling that morality must exist outside of us, I think, is because we're stuck on the idea of morality that is set in stone, that has definite rules. But in fact, it's something that you have to keep constantly working at. You know the direction of the good, and you do the best you can on any given day. And I do believe that when you take away enough dignity from a person, they lose this sense. I and I think when we all feel humiliated or terrible, there's a moment where we'd blow up the planet if we could. You feel bad when you feel bad. And I don't think anybody is morally above getting ground down enough to feel a little evil, little bad. But when you're okay, a lot of us, babies, will share. A lot of us have a tremendous amount of a feeling of good. And and that's all I'm claiming. That there's a feeling of good that is somewhat universally human, that it has some markers that are general. Share food, don't randomly kill people. If you walk into a group of people you don't know, see what they're doing before you start bossing people around. There are some simple rules. Maybe there are no more than the ones I just told you, but share food and don't kill anybody randomly. Those are a big place to start. And then we make friends, and we are suckers. You know, we make friends. And again, it's evolutionary, but once evolution made it up, we live in the world of it. And it's very strange and very beautiful and very sad. And it's us, it's what we are. And I do think that the fact that we were here doing it is enough. There's nobody who could have watched it, who could make it. What would eternal even mean? So he's sitting there remembering us? What help is that? Forget him. It matters that the story of the only piece of the universe that can think and feel, us little people over here, having our thinking and feeling, it matters without anybody watching. It matters because everything we do matters to the next generation. I put in the book, George Eliot, Marianne Evans, great atheist from the 19th century, translated atheist works from lots of, she was an amazing straight helper to certainly the separation of church and state cause. And she wrote this poem, The Choir Invisible, which I didn't even think was that great a poem at first, but now I love it so much. And it just says, she just wants to be part of the choir invisible. And what she did for me was really helped was to feel that choir invisible that made everything that is around us, the music we listen to, the food we eat, the computer, the fabric, the everything, people, somebody said, I can't go to bed yet. I'm going to finish this. Some people worked and they gave. They worked to change laws, okay, because they were pissed, but still they changed the law and we get to live freely because of it. So feeling the choir invisible has turned into a kind of imaginary community for me, which I think is a very healthy thing. You really start to appreciate and be grateful for everything that took an awful lot of brains. Um, and and also to feel that I can be part of the choir invisible and that I can be invisible. I mean, sure, it's nice. You and I both have names on books. And so, but, but to know that you did good, that you cared for, for other people when they needed care, that person is going to be able to go on and give care. And you're part of the story of virtue of the greatest creatures in the galaxy that we have found, humanity.
The
And it is a
thinking meat.
beautiful, strange
Yes.
story.
Yeah,
A
that
beautiful,
comment
strange story.
by William Lane Craig, that line of argument, if there's no God, then and the universe just dies, then the Holocaust doesn't matter. So this was in a debate he did with Shelley Kagan, the philosopher, who said, it doesn't matter. It matters to the Jews who were killed, and it matters to their families, and it should matter to you and I now. What we do now matters. And so I wrote one of my Scientific American columns on this called Alvy's Error, Alvy Singer, Woody Allen's character in Annie Hall, where, he has a flashback as a child. He won't do his homework. Mom takes him to a psychiatrist. Why won't you do your homework? The universe is expanding.
Brooklyn isn't expanding.
Yeah. Nothing matters because the universe is going to blow up someday, and his mother upbraids him. What's the universe got to do with it? We live in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn's not expanding.
That's right.
So,
meanwhile, I live in Brooklyn right now, and it does seem to be expanding. But
I noticed that. Yes, that's funny.
It certainly is true that scene is lodged in so many of our memories because it was so powerfully true. Especially young people, I think, have a sense of this. But I want to say with great emphasis that we have overdone the sense that the world ends. We've overdone it because we're trying to convince people about climate change, which I'm not arguing against at all, but I am saying 200 years from now, they will be doing Shakespeare. Climate change will not stop that. And I think young people sometimes think that their retirement plan is the apocalypse, and that ain't going to work. We're still going to be here. And it makes sense to build, and it makes sense to care. And the idea of the sun expanding, I think it's very important for people, especially who have just lost an idea of eternity, to try to think all the way to the end. But 14 billion years is so long that it doesn't mean anything. We're here for good. The idea of this 14 billion, make it 1 billion years, it means nothing to humanity. Nothing. But we're talking about the sun starting to expand in something like 13 or 14 billion years. That doesn't mean...
It doesn't matter.
Is it? Okay,
Yes.
So we're here 13 billion and we only have 4 billion left. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, before the sun expands.
But in any case, no matter how many billions of years we have left, it should not change where we bank. It should not change whether we have a garden or not. And I think it does. I think we have overemphasized a sense of oblivion, and what human beings have to give each other is in a bubble over here that has nothing to do with that oblivion. And it's here to enjoy, to add to be part of, to suffer. It's not all happy, but it is human. It is rich. And we all know that art and literature make us feel connected to a richer version than the cheapest one we can find if we look for it to be cheap and flat. Yeah. And I think inviting a little poetry into your life and rereading instead of trying to read a ton. I think these things can give people, and making peace with the idea that it's good to have a calendar of rituals in your life. It helps you notice the seasons and feel life go by. And these things, we know that they existed before religion, but I really want to emphasize it as not just Christmas that was existed before. It's every aspect of religion. It was all there before, and in other cultures, some of it's outside religion, some of it's in. Christianity doesn't even have some of the wonderful fixes that other religions have thought of. There's no, generally no travel to a river like the Ganges. You get in that river and it takes your sins away. There are all sorts of interesting things that are in other religions. And I present them in each chapter and say, look, here's a couple ways that religious people deal with shame or, um, you know, grief or, different things. And just to see on, in a page and a half, oh, there are actual things you can do and they say something. So why don't I do a thing and say something if I'm feeling feelings that I really want to either enhance or get rid of? And yeah, so the book really takes you through, and I think I have a strange friendliness towards religious ritual for an atheist because I am such an atheist that I'm safe. I don't feel like if I touch religion, it's going to get on me and I'm going to get converted.
Certainly not. All right, Jennifer, we're coming up on an hour and a half here. Let's end on a positive emotion, love, because you devote quite a bit of the book to that as well, instead of just death and all that.
That's right.
How does a rationalist poet think about love? Here, I just have to repeat my one fun joke from Tim Minchin, the singer-songwriter, who joked, what do you call love without evidence? Stalking. I liked
stalking. Oh God,
stalking. Yes, yeah.
Right.
Because if you're pursuing somebody and you get nothing back and you keep pursuing them, actually, you do need evidence.
Right. That's really funny. It goes in a bunch of different directions. Yeah, love outside of religion doesn't generally make people come and say ask questions. Certainly, people ask questions about the wedding. What do you do with that? And I have a whole chapter devoted to that, which partially I don't think it's bad to have some things at your wedding that you don't agree with. Just it's important to have something there that you do. That is, you don't have to totally swap out the prayer if some people need it there. But then there's the question of who to love. And I think that religion doesn't always do this work. But in Judaism, there's the notion of the Bashirt. Um, and and that's the person you were sort of destined for, though there is sort of room for two people to fall in love, and then the Bashirtness comes upon them. So it's a loose kind of spiritual term. And in Christianity, there are lots of different examples, as in most religions, of priests choosing couples, helping to arrange marriages. So what do we do outside that? And I think that very much depends on what our excesses are. But what I talk about in the book is how, through history, it's the problem with love has never been abundance. There's always been, just the people and your parents know, and how big can that circle get? It's and the fancier you are, so that you'd be able to find more people, the more your parents say only these 3 people can you marry because they have enough money or family, whatever. So it's a very strange thing that we're living in a world where everyone's just swiping along. And when you find someone, if they piss you off, you move on to the next person because of that abundance. And so I think that that it's similar to the idea of which life should I choose and did I choose the right one. There are ways to make love sacred once you have it. It isn't easy. Nobody says it's easy. Nobody says anybody should stay together forever if they don't want to. But we could have a little bit more romanticism of old love in this culture, right? We really like falling in love movies, and it's exciting and everything. But most of us are hoping that movie leads to long-term love, which is all about fuming and putting up with and picking up someone else's mother at the airport and all of that. And so, yeah, just like everything else, you need the poetry that's involved with that. And there is poetry about old love that makes you feel like you are on the only great adventure.
Mm. That reminds me of the other Tim Minchin song that I like. It's "If I Hadn't Met You," I think is the name of the song.
Mm,
So it's a love song to his wife, and they've been married
right.
forever. And if I
I
hadn't
know
met
this one. Yeah.
you know that one, yeah. If I hadn't met you, then these wonderful things wouldn't happen. And then midway through the song, if I hadn't met you, I would have met somebody else. Maybe
Right.
they were taller than you, but not as pretty, funnier than you, but not as athletic.
Right. And it's funny. I think it's also like it's slightly mean, right? And
Yeah.
why is it mean? Because we want the fantasy that at least once you're chosen, the person isn't still choosing, right? And you want the fantasy that once you're chosen, something special about you has made it so the person cannot imagine. I do think that this idea is sold to women more than to men. So I'll more often hear men say, "Oh, love is real, but it's, you can always get it again in another place." And maybe they've, you know, but people who have made long-term commitments have other things to say about the benefits thereof and the beauty thereof. And so, yeah, how you manage that in the secular world is awfully similar to in the religious world. You do have to sing its praises, and and the Bible did have some long-term love in it between men and women, and also between friends. And um, but literature is also filled with long-term love and friends, uh, and sometimes we all know the same works of art, so we can discuss them. I'm hoping that if you can choose poems from anywhere, but if we all choose some from the stock of great um, world poetry helps you to get out of your own culture and own self without having to be sort of identity based. I really don't like the idea of saying, well, I have to collect one of this type and one of this type, like a chocolate box of identity, which we often do in this culture right now because we're trying to uh, fix, a racist world. But if you look for world poetry, you're not going to end up with a pile that looks chosen by identity, and yet you're still going to get people from all over the world of every different, you know, um, persuasion, and yet, um, if if we're choosing from the great poems, at least some of our poems, we'll sometimes have them in common, and that will matter. I think it's yeah, the idea that we could all have a little bit of a kind of a prayer book and that they match each other's a little bit sometimes. I will say that poets already have this, and I'd be surprised if they write them down because if you read if you are addicted to 12 poems, and I will say a lot of poets who read hundreds of poems are really only addicted to 12 or 20 or 50,
Really,
but
really.
well, because you fall in love with these great poems. And no, all the work doesn't get you that way. Sometimes you fall in love with it because of who gave it to you or because you saw it in a movie. And I say in this book very clearly because I am rattled by how often people are embarrassed by having gotten their favorite poem from a movie. If you fell in love with a poem in a movie, it came to you with a tremendous amount of cultural capital. People put a lot of work into you understanding and loving and being moved by this poem. Take it. We should all take it. And we should all love that poem. Yeah.
The other thing on the sort of quantifying love, the problem with it, I'll just use an example here. I had a girlfriend once that wanted to know exactly what it is I liked about her, like
Mm,
quantify, like looks and humor,
yeah.
intelligence, and so on. And it occurred to me, if I said, well, you're a 9 in looks and an 8 in intelligence or whatever,
No, that wouldn't
it,
go over.
it suggests that if somebody who was a 10 or a 9.5 comes along,
Mm.
well, then I'm just going to go with that one because I'm just doing a calculation. So the correct answer is there is no exact reason why. Because I
I
just
think
do.
that she just wanted you to say how much you loved her and
Right,
how
right,
great she
right.
was in different
Right.
ways.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I think I think on some level we want to be loved for some ineffable thing.
Right, right.
And the idea that you could commit to someone and that makes it permanent no matter what your brain does sometimes. And that, you can try to enjoy that at least as long as it lasts. We all know, I mean, there is a back
Right.
door, right? But yeah, it's it's all in the story of humanity. It's all already in the literature. But I think that for our culture right now, poems are short, they're powerful, they're direct. They seem to be sent over the internet every day. Really good ones I see go by, brilliant poems, but they go by too fast. And I'm just saying to people, if you love one, grab it, keep it somewhere, read it over and over. It'll change your
Well,
life.
I would give that same advice for your book. Get this book, The Wonder Paradox. It's filled with great poetry, but also good stories. Got a nice narrative. You're a great writer. I always enjoy your books.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Jennifer. Thank you so
Thanks.
much. Thank you
This was
for
great.
everything you've done.